And so I was driving a van with 8 college students for 1,835 miles. And, it was to see, be in the places and spaces of the civil rights movement, at least as it played out in the Deep South. And so I tried to do my due diligence before we hit the road. And we had a tour at it's called the Emmett Till Interpretive Center. It's in Sumner, Mississippi, and that's the courthouse that where the trial was of his murderers. You see that in Pete's film. And it was in the, I guess, kind of office of the interpretive center, the kind of exhibit area, where we actually saw, and in Pete, you can see that in the film, the original marker that had been shot up and then actually cut off of its base, and they just placed it as sort of an object lesson in the center to see. But it was only on being on site there that I started realizing there was a series of markers at all different kind of key sites that were part of that story. Didn't have time with the students to try looking for these markers, but it was when Pete and I were back there about a month later, as it happened, that we, I guess, went to Glendora, which is where most of those scenes were filmed in the film. And that's literally where the marker had originally been. You see us looking at a new one that's there that's then been shut up again. But, I guess I'd emphasize, like Okolona or like Fargo, which Pete has referenced today, we're very much off the beaten path in these places that we're in, and we're sort of looking for something, but we're not entirely sure what we're looking for. So there's this kind of planned serendipities would obviously be an oxymoron, but there's something sort of like that where we know we're way off the grid, and sometimes it's a bust, and there's not, we don't come back with some amazing story that changes us. But this, what played out in Glendora was certainly just kind of a remarkable series of things. Yeah, and I guess it should be emphasized, we're in the middle of the Mississippi Delta. That's where Glendora is. And it's still, even with demographic changes and changes over time, there's a significant concentration of African Americans. Many of the counties in the Delta, I think almost all of them, are Black majority counties. And so we're, here we show up. We're obviously not from around there. We're looking at this sign, and just the sort of nonchalance and even hospitality of Terrell, who walks over to us and just starts chatting with us. Just in that encounter, there's so much going on there that if there was suspicion or if there was hostility, that would be totally understandable. I mean, just given, who the social group we come from, the history that's happened in that place. And, as you can see in the film, we didn't encounter that, and we're just struck by that, as we have been in other places. That's probably all I have to say right now.
The way that sort of serendipity extended for me was that image that I used for the poster flyer or whatever for this event was which is a capture from the film towards the end where the actual riverbank. And back in October, I was at hey, George is here. I got very fortunate opportunity to be at an opening for Sally Mann retrospective at the High Museum in Atlanta, which was an absolutely incredible exhibit. Unfortunately had to close early even before all this happened. But and I was a little bit familiar with her work before, but it's the difference between, it's like the photograph, and it's like with visiting the site where something happened. When you see one of Sally's great big prints in person is different than seeing it in a book. But I was really kind of blown away because I don't think I was familiar with this image before, but this was part of the exhibit. I don't know if you can see it very well here, but I'm gonna try. It's her photograph, and she's a very different form of photography than most people do, of the exact same spot. And it's called it's from a book she did called Deep South, Untitled Emmett Till Riverbank of 1998. It's kind of wild that, like, while we were, we were just setting out on this whole journey, she was in these same many of the same spots, taking a picture that, I would unknowingly basically kind of replicate many years later. So anyway, and if you're not familiar with Sally Mann's work, as I really encourage you to acquaint yourself with it. She's an incredible photographer, but she's also, I don't know of anyone who has really written about photography, memory, and the South all at the same time as profoundly and beautifully as she has done. She wrote a memoir called Hold Still that's just extraordinary. Don't you think, George? Yeah. Anyway. And I think that's, this may be getting a little too esoteric, but maybe not. I sometimes think of a road trip like this as almost a kind of spiritual exercise. That, it requires you a little bit to sort of give up your presuppositions, maybe, or your need for a plan, or your need for a certain sort of destination. And that kind of openness to discovery, I feel like, is one of the things that has been the most generative. And sometimes it's not, very often it's unpleasant. But I think those are the things that have yielded the most insight, I think, just from other people, especially when you meet people like Terrell or Nellie Adams, or people like that whose stories you would never really have had an opportunity to stumble on. So,
hey Pete.
Hey,
Yeah, hey, good to see you. Thank you for sharing that. That's
yeah.
awesome. So about a week ago, I got a chance to enter this drama in a way that was to really feel how caustic and venomous this really is. Just simply, my wife and I were talking about the Aubrey situation, the family. And I said, I just been thinking about an apology, just writing an apology, because a little about my background in conservative Christian radio, and I was a huge Christian Reconstructionist, Christian nationalist. So I said, I can write an apology. So I did, and you'll find it on Facebook, an apology from a former Christian conservative. And I just spoke to my heart to the Aubrey family and to people like them who just haven't been heard. And I just spoke from my heart. Sorry for not believing you. For just a few, it's short, but I did touch a few hot items, like sorry that um, gun rights are selectively killing your children. For me, caring more about my um, economy than your jobs, and just a few things ended up with a heartfelt. It feels good to finally be home in my journey on the streets and among people who have been marginalized. Um, I added a postscript after that just to say, um, explain why I would speak out specifically for these marginalized people and not for everybody, because obviously people like me don't have a systemic problem getting justice. So somebody needs to speak out for those who have trouble getting justice. Anyway, in a nutshell, to tie that up, I could not believe. I paid $10 a day for some promotion of that ad, so it went randomly, not quite randomly. I selected a religious audience, and the vile things that came back at me are just indescribable. How I'm fueling the fires of racism, and that everything was a effing something. Occasionally, my friends defended. The only person I didn't know who defended was um, gay, I think maybe transvestite person from New York City, said some wonderful things about me. I did mention LGBTQ in my apology. I apologized to them as well for what I had done. And again, that apology was very short, but the vile things that came back, um, it was scary. After about 3 days, I said, yeah, I can stand up to this, but I have a wife. There are two single women that live on our property here. I shut it down. I said, this is scary. The people who were opposed to my simple apology were scary, very scary.
Yeah. I'm sorry you had to.
Oh no, it's good.
But yeah,
I felt like I'm one of those the people I've been talking about. I really felt very much like them.
I don't know how anybody else feels, but I do. It does seem like, and I don't know the reason for this, but it does seem like there is a lot of us, I think, feel a kind of urgency about doing something, whether it was the Run with Maud thing that lots of people did on his birthday. But and maybe it's the nature of social media and engagement and all that stuff that's different. But and sometimes like these hashtags and stuff do correspond to a really a real profound sense of urgency about this. Like, we have to do something, we have to kind of respond in some way. I guess there's always the danger in a culture that that privileges the immediate, that the hashtag sort of phenomenon, it comes and goes because it gets replaced by some other hashtag. But I think it's the connection with Emmett Till doesn't seem to me to be overstated. I don't think there's a lot of historical parallels, and I'm maybe this will be one of those moments that kind of catalyzes people like you, James, and others to sort of do something, I don't know, that might have some sort of lasting significance or effect. I was just thinking about, like, for a moment, about the parallels. The Emmett Till thing didn't Emmett Till's lynching didn't really become national news until his mother, Mamie Till, decided to hold his funeral with an open casket. And when those photographs of his body were published in Life magazine, then it caught everybody's attention in the same way in which this, the video that came out a couple of weeks ago did similar effect, and which in one sense kind of speaks to the power of photography here, the power of image to provoke and prompt and to spur and to agitate in a way that just words alone don't. But anyway, thanks for sharing that, James. That's I'll since nobody else is talking, I'll just keep going because that's the danger here. If nobody else says anything, I'm just going to keep going and by the way, I should tell you that, well, maybe John should tell you this, but if he's still with us, I haven't bored him away. I've become a lot chattier over the last couple of years with these things, I guess. And there were whole stretches in the first or second or third tour where I would go, well, how long, John, without saying a word? 7 or 8 days, maybe.
This was in '97. Granted, we were younger. It was 12 days straight. And I think Pete said about 12 sentences.
But I'm sure they were really thoughtful sentences.
They were so deep.
They were really. I was working on those.
Actually, on this is true. On the it was like night 7, or it was probably like night 7. We were driving on the Natchez Trace in Mississippi. It was getting dark. We were heading to what we hoped would be a campsite. And Pete said, no irony, not kidding. So what do you think of the Kantian turn towards subjectivity? And anyway.
I don't even know what I would say to that, to my own question.
He's matured since then. That's the best I can say.
I was a sad person then. Very sad. George is recording. Well, thank you, George, for recording this, because I don't know if I'm doing it.
Pete, I have a question for you and anybody else who's here. Is this hate that James referred to, and that was you can see that is the energy behind so much of this racial problem that we've got in this country, and you can kind of see the roots of it. But what has made it go away in some places, and why are some people holding on to it? For me, I would just like to understand why someone wants to hold on to it. It would seem to me to make your life miserable to look at people according to the color of their skin and judge people that way. And so I'm just wondering about what is the psychology that makes people want to hold on to that, and that makes people respond to James the way that he did when he sent this apology out. If anybody understands that and can shed some light on it, I would be interested to know.
Yeah, me too. I do not know. I mean,
it seems to be fear in a way. There seems to be fear among those who are holding on to that, fear of some unknown or something. But it would just help a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my I mean, anybody else has more insight on this than me, please interrupt me, but because I don't have much. But I think one of the people that I go back to is Saint Augustine, who, when he's talking in the City of God about basically drawing the sort of distinction between the earthly city and the city of God. And he says what characterizes all human activity since the fall is what he calls the desire for domination. And in his Latin, it's libido dominandi, the libido. So it's actually more like a lust to dominate. And the great genius of Augustine, reveals itself here, because he says that the paradox here is that if you desire to dominate other people, you end up being dominated yourself by the desire, this lust to master others. And unfortunately, I don't know how much Christian tradition in particular took Augustine seriously enough on the question of slavery, for example, in which, and there are other authorities in the ancient church one could point to who, had, again, so to go back to the contingency, had, for example, the church listened to Gregory of Nyssa, for example, who gave a very vigorous kind of polemic against the idea of ownership of other humans in the 4th century. Christian history might have looked different. World history might have looked different. I don't know. But that sort of fundamental of the desire to dominate is, unfortunately, that's characteristic of all of us. But the hate, the hatred part of it, I think, is harder to understand, because you can understand philosophically, you can make sense of why people do evil things. If we kind of keep talking about Augustine for a minute, then, in his view, no one acts for an evil purpose, but for some end or goal which they or we perceive as good. They always act under the aspect, or kind of with some, even if it's a really sort of perverse good, even if it's pleasure or you get some sort of a gratification out of it, there's a goal. The aim of human action is always oriented towards some kind of good, not good in the objective absolute sense, but in the sense of being something that is beneficial in some way. Hatred, I feel like, is a little bit harder to make sense of, because and I tried to, Greg maybe could talk about this a little bit. I don't know if there are other theologians in the room who are more learned than I am, but I'm not sure that the idea of hatred has been as thoroughly worked out. Even Thomas Aquinas, who talks about hatred, it's almost like it doesn't quite exist for him, because it's just such a, I think for him, it's like the fruit of a soul that has turned so inward upon itself. And that's Augustine's language of sin as a kind of curving in upon yourself, the twisted, literally kind of a twistedness, where your love, the good that you desire, is for your own self and for no one else. And so that creates a kind of vortex, sort of moral vortex, in which you just become, increasingly sort of sucked into your own reality.
Yeah, I think that's helpful, and I'll just put in a plug for Gregory Nissa in general. But I think Steve Long, D. Stephen Long, he's known as writing more, but Steve has a helpful way of talking about this that sort of continues to ride on the back of what you're talking about with Augustine there, the sort of the evil as privation of the good, or headed sort of tending toward nothingness kind of thing. That when you look at someone like Hitler, and I would argue that this is the case too with those of us who struggling with the racialized understanding of humanity, or eugenics understanding of humanity that we deal with in the United States and our history, is that when you look at someone like Hitler, Hitler doesn't first hate the Jew. He loves something more fundamental. What he loves is this fictionalized understanding, or what is a fiction, but he loves this idea of the Aryan race, this pure Aryan race. And his hatred of the Jews sort of is an outgrowth out of that. So I think that's the way, I think it's helpful to think about that when I forget what Lucille said, that this is rooted in fear. I really think when people perceive, it's just amazing to me how poor people in the South who are white people oftentimes will have more in common with poor Black people than either one of them do with a rich landowning white person. But through Thomas Jefferson, Notes on Virginia, and those kinds of things, the scheme of saying, well, you might be poor, but at least you're white. I think having that kind of vision I love something about my identity there, a constructed identity. And then when someone messes with that world, I think then fear can kind of come out of that and cause me to then hate maybe that which tries to deconstruct that idea of my privileged place in the world, if that makes sense.
It does. I just wonder how you ever get past it. I mean, because you would want to get past it for the sake of those people, it's got to be a hard on the person who hates too, in even some subconscious way. So where do we get past it? That's the question of today, I think.
If I can offer brief comments on to Lucille's question, and let me just point out for the group that for many years now, Pete has claimed that he abandoned theology many years ago. I'm just going to go out on a limb and say that that's not true, based on the extensive theorizing this morning. So I'm a historian. I'm coming at it from that point of view, and I think I'd say, like, to me, the violence comes out of a larger fabric that we'll just call white supremacy. And by that, I don't mean fringe ideas of a few, ACLU hate groups, that kind of thing. I just mean a social structure, a system of organizing society that's set up to benefit a certain social group to the detriment of another social group. So, like, that defines our whole American society. And I think the violence, it's just one expression of that. But rhetoric like, well, these are good schools, or that's a bad neighborhood, or don't go there, that's dangerous, stay away from people like that. That's a rhetorical version of the violence. It's all bound up with in the same fabric. And that's where I think, I think there needs to be a lot of self-interrogation, self-implication of white folks, because we participate in that fabric and we benefit from it. And I'd say, just thinking about Pete and I in Glendora, flip the script and imagine an all white, predominantly white county where there'd been a shocking act of violence against a white teenager, and two Black guys show up in a minivan curious about that history, right? I mean, Pete and I just do this, and we just don't even think about the fact that, you know, we can just show up somewhere, and it's just like we're, you know, and again, that's part of that whole fabric that we're all in. I think that just of recent things I've read, that Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me, it's a pretty thin little book, tons to ruminate on in its pages. Won the National Book Award, I think, in 2015 or 2016. But in terms of sort of, and he's got essentially a secular, he's not theologically coming at it, but how could you move past it is a question he wrestles with. And I think that if you, again, I find it a very provocative and book and a lot to think about there.
Thank you. I will read that.
Yeah, highly recommend it.
Good.
Yeah. Lucy, one thing I don't have a clue about the people who think like that. To me, what really is driving the thing is what we allow. It's kind of like Reinhold Niebuhr's quote about they came for the socialists and I wasn't a socialist, so I didn't do anything. Then they came for the homosexuals, they came for the Jews, and finally they came for me because we didn't do anything. To me, these people are always there, but what are we allowing? And from my experience and my friends, my past community are still my friends. I'm still in touch with people in high places in Christian radio, and they're being silent when it comes to, because the president they support is supporting A and B, therefore they will turn their back literally on the worst things. And because I work on the streets a lot now and with some immigrants, and everyone that hates Trump hates Christians because they just see Christians are supporting Trump. They're one and the same. I know they're not, but for the large part, the conservative Christians are supporting. So the answer to that's driving me crazy, and I write a lot about it at my website, it's called holychaoscommunity.com, is to help people who can do something, think about things from a little different perspective. And I know that's hard to do, but yeah, that's that's my only answer. I don't have a clue what to do with the people down there who are really shooting guns and stuff, but there's a whole lot of people in this country allowing that and saying nothing about it who could.
I think there's also the element here of subtle shifts in language that affect the kind of violence that John was talking about. I mean, John himself, you know, you encountered this recently with the Augusta riot and the language around the Wikipedia article, which was edited by somebody to I think edit out racist commentary. What this other person thought was racist commentary because they didn't like the use of the terms white supremacy. They preferred, you know, rioters to, you know, I forget what to some more, you know, less sort of pejorative term. So, I mean, you can see this at the line level, as it were, like of the way we tell these stories down to the words. Like the words make a difference. And I think there is a type of, you know, there is the kind of physical violence that we're all familiar with now that still continues, but there's also the kind of violence at the kind of grammatical level, if you like, where the change of one single word from white supremacist to God-fearing Christian or something, like that's not an innocent change. And so the language of the from the Ahmaud Arbery murder, where, you know, and I can't recall exactly the source for this language, but it may have been in the one of the groups that were defending the perpetrators. The claim was that Ahmaud Arbery did not comply with simple commands. You would never hear a black person say this of a white person, that they just didn't follow basic commands, because the presumption is that when a white person speaks to you, you're supposed to do what they, if you are a person of color, you're supposed to do what they say. Like that's the kind of cultural inheritance that we all live with. And we may be like completely oblivious to the you know, hubris in that kind of language. But also with respect to Arbery, this kind of language has a very, very long history in places like, especially like in Glenn County or McIntosh County. And I'm sure you could all, you know, pick your own counties or throw a dart at a map and it might have the same effect. When John B. Gordon was testifying before Congress, John Gordon was a Confederate general and the titular head of the Klan in Georgia in the 1860s. Even though it wasn't called that, it had a different name, but he was basically the what we would call like the Grand Wizard. And he, during congressional hearings about the Klan, and I apologize for the glare off my forehead. During the hearings where Congress was investigating these groups, Gordon talked about the Negroes down there in Brunswick. And he was actually quite a lengthy bit of testimony, goes on for several pages, where he contrasts the African Americans of Atlanta, for example, with those of the Georgia coast, whom he regards as unruly, vulgar. They don't comply with simple commands, and the like. And it's a very interesting, if you can make it through it, it's a very interesting example of this kind of linguistic subtlety that is, it may not be really that subtle, but it's it's very, very deep. So in places like Brunswick, you know, which is majority African American, if I'm right about that, that kind of presumption, I think, still, it's, I wouldn't say that it disappeared. So that, you know, what, there's something, there's a story behind this language of this, well, this black person didn't comply with simple commands, therefore, you know.
There's a theological component to all that too. I mean, there's a way in which there's no way to explain the way slavery as an institution and then Jim Crow as an institution were able to exist and thrive and prosper for so long, except for the fact they were baptized by the church. And I'm saying this as someone who attempts to be a faithful and believing and acting Christian, but like there's a whole history we have of creating theologies that allowed for all of this, and part of that continues in this sort of emphasis on kind of law and order and that sort of thing, which if you read Brian Stevenson's work, I mean, he's trying to connect the dots between slavery and mass incarceration today, and so much of that really comes out of the framing of all this, of God's correct order for the world, and there were distinct races for a reason, and one was meant to rule over another, and all that was used theologically to baptize this. And then we created theologies to over personalize the gospel and to make it all about individual salvation in a way that allowed us to, in the South where I'm from, to live our lives and see ourselves as good, faithful Christian people when we were participating in systemic and structural things that were inherently unjust and unfair, because we had over personalized a gospel that was about going to heaven when we die, and not about participating in any way in God's kingdom now, and being people of justice and peace and reconciliation now. So I think that the church has such a big role to play in how and not being silent on this. I mean, it's so easy. That's what that word, so politically charged right now, privilege, looks like. It looks like a church feeling like they don't have to say something about this, and that knowing when they do, it's going to be really costly. Like James said, you're going to get completely fired at, because we're hitting existential issues of identity and just all. But it's really important that the church step into this and help to create a culture that's different than one that the church helped to create to begin with.
Pete, can I jump in here with just a couple of thoughts? I'll be haunted by Lucille's question for the rest of the day at least, and I appreciate all these different perspectives. And Lucille, that Ta-Nehisi Coates book is a game changer. It's worth the afternoon it'll take to read. But just some disparate dots that I think also factor in here. And I would say that targets would be the Declaration of Independence, the history of the Comanche Nation, Malcolm X, and Dr. Seuss. And I think a big part of what is involved in that hatred that we've been challenged with is the capacity to dehumanize another. And so if you think of the Declaration of Independence, where we reference the Indians as savages, that was a very, very important rhetorical move, back to Pete's point about language. And the Comanches, I'm a little more familiar with them because I've just been studying them, but they weren't unique, but their name for themselves was people. They didn't have a fancy name for their tribe. They were people, which made everybody else what, right? So that facilitated all sorts of approaches to other humans, because we were people, you're something else. We're people, you're savages. And when I think about the story of Malcolm X, and so much of his career was characterized by hatred, among many other things. But when he made that fateful trip late in his life to Mecca and saw humanity in people who he had perceived as other than human, and that connection that he made really transformed the last part of his life, because it rattled him past the mode of hatred, which is so easy to sustain when you're seeing others as something other than human. And the last plug here, since we're pitching books, is Dr. Seuss, that famous theologian, wrote a story about Sneetches. And you remember how a politician, Mr. McChappie, I think, was able to convince people that having a star on your belly or not having a star on your belly mattered. Yeah. And that was kind of a way that they were inclined to see otherness, right? Savages or people or not people. And the story only gets its happy ending when people kind of got so confused, the Sneetches rather, got so confused they couldn't keep track of the stars anymore. Yeah. And right now, we're looking for ways to distinguish ourselves and to make ourselves feel valuable by seeing others as something different.
Hmm.
And, you know, somebody made the point, I think it was Greg, but about the fact, or John maybe, that in theory, class might be a reason that people could connect, and that's being discarded in favor of other wedges. But whether it's stars or calling people savages or defining ourselves as the people, I think that's just kind of a universal thread.
Mm-hmm.
I wish I could say some of that in Latin, Pete.
That's okay. Dr. Seuss, you got extra points for Dr. Seuss reference.
I think one problem here is that, and this is a problem I think with someone like Ta-Nehisi Coates as well, is there, and I'm saying this after listening some to African American socialists speak on this issue as well, that there's a sort of false choice in our culture between, on the one hand, talking about problems of race, on the other hand, talking about problems of class. And there's been, say, in the DNC, the Democratic Party, there's been an opting for talking about problems of race, but not problems of class. And I would want to say that that's a false choice. People like W.E.B. Du Bois, Martin Luther King, where they were valid socialists, and they saw a tie between, I think, if I understand them right, between racialized thinking and economic structures. Mm-hmm. And I think to say that you have to choose either one of those at the expense of the other is a problem, because I think part of the unique problem in the United States is the nasty mixture that we have of a capitalist system that always is going to have a few that are at the top, built on the backs of a lot of others, as well as this racialized history. And I think it's to have to choose between those two is part of the problem, because I think they're implicated in one another.
And Greg, you probably saw that one of the more vigorous attacks on the 1619 Project was launched by the Communist Party of the U.S. So the attempts to drive those wedges come from all directions.
That's interesting. And I think one of the things, you know, the Sneetches may be the best kind of critique of this, is that how those, and I think back to, I think there was Todd's point about theologies or Christianity's implicatedness in all of this, is a tendency to attribute those kinds of differences that you were describing to nature, to something in the natural order, savage, you know, or, you know, a certain kind of racial quality comes with natural dispositions towards violence, for example. But the Sneetches example is great because it shows how arbitrary all of those are. They're not grounded in nature at all. They're grounded entirely in power, you know, in the desire of one group to dominate another, to go back, Lucille, to Augustine. And in the case of National Socialism in Germany, and in the case of the United States of America now, there is, in order to achieve this sort of power for any particular group, historically, you know, this is observable, you have to dehumanize the other. Well, first of all, you have to manufacture the other. You have to create a Jews or Negroes or whatever. You have to sort of manufacture a racial identity over against which to sort of assert yourself. And I'll shut up about Augustine, I promise. But this is one of my favorite. That's one of my favorite parts of the city of God, because I think it's so clever. Augustine is talking about the Romans and saying how the Romans, they have gods for everything. They've got a god for the sea. They've got a god for the sky. They've got a god for like fusilli pasta. They've got a god for, cannoli. It's everything has got a god. But he talks about how Roman virtue is dependent upon the wickedness of their enemies. And he talked, throughout Roman history, he goes through this and says, how the Romans' greatness depends upon the badness of their enemies. So he says that if Rome were serious about itself, if Roman culture were consistent, they would also have a god to foreign iniquity. They would deify the evil of their enemies, because, in other words, they make a god out of how bad the non-Romans are. Because without it, there is no Roman virtue. There is no virtue to Roman society. So there's a wonderful stroke on Augustine's part by saying, in a weird way, by making your enemy's wickedness so necessary to your own goodness, you actually worship the wickedness of others, and you make it a kind of deity, which I think connects with what we've been discussing. This isn't just an ancient Roman phenomenon. It's certainly true in American history. I mean, we've been pretty good at, making the wickedness of our enemies historically necessary to our own sense of virtue.
I'll just build.
It certainly goes on today.
I'm sorry.
It's not just history; it's happening right now.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Go ahead, Matt.
I was just building on, what the whole conversation, but what Ty was saying about interrogating history. We had the privilege of being able to take our whole family on this 5-month sabbatical to South America, and like one of the most. That's why this Ibram Kendi book has been really powerful to me, because he tracks back to the very beginnings of European engagement with folks in South America. And so what I see in this book and sort of reflecting on that trip is like American identity and American experience was sort of broadened to include both of the continents, North and South. And, I'll never forget this fort we went to in Uruguay, and the middle of the fort is this stone with these two parallel planes that you can see through. And that stone sits on the line, I had to look it up, that represents the Treaty of Madrid or the Treaty of Tordesillas. I can never remember which one. But this was the papal order that basically the Pope sat down, looked at a map, and Spain and Portugal were fighting, and he just drew a line. And he went, okay, the west of this line, Spain, you can have, and the east of that line, Portugal, you can have. Now stop fighting. And when you see this like physical reminder of something that was at 350, almost 400 years old, mid 1700s, and you're like, oh, that's a rock that defined a line that the Pope drew, that allowed Spain and Portugal to carve up not just the Americas, but the entire planet, and say, go about your business of conquering, and I've now validated it. And it's just, I think so, there are no words to start to see the depth of of this structure that we have all been complicit in. And I think also in some ways liberating that this is a 500-year-old system that we are all stuck in. I don't know. There's no way for me to personally like process how I will fix it or how I will go save someone else from the same grip of this exquisitely effective systemic thing. But I love the reminder to just interrogate the idea of the personal and the way the gospel is always felt personal, and that allows you to ignore the systemic. So I just wanted to shout Todd out for that because I thought it was a really helpful reminder.
But that's a great example of like being there. You know, when you were there and you saw this spot, you were on this spot, you saw it. It had a concreteness that it might not have if you just read about it in like the eyewitness guide or whatever.
No, and it's just marker, just like your photo of the bank. You know, it was a marker, and in so many ways, you know, to the whole ethos of the trips. It was like you have to go see that and feel it, and that to me that is a form of interrogating. Yeah, interrogating.
Well, and Pete, and I'd be curious to know how it went with John's students on that trip. But at some point, it seems like there's a really significant thing that happens when you cease to see yourself as a tourist in those locations, right? Because that's not somebody else's riverbank. That's your riverbank. That's not Mississippi's highway marker that's getting shot up. That's yours. Mm-hmm. And when we make that jump from being spectators in those, you know, places of tragedy and you know, being owners, I think that's a pretty significant jump, and I think that's part of what your work is helping us do.
Yeah, thanks. I do feel like I think maybe when we started out, it was more a kind of tourism. Maybe, I don't know if you would say that, John, but or closer to it anyway. Because I don't think we hadn't like fully theorized what we were doing. It was just sort of, hey, let's go see. And I mean, animated by a few, you know, a handful of kind of hunches about things. But I do feel like, without kind of commenting on kind of the tourism industry, because I don't know anything about the tourism industry. But I do think we generally have Americans are so notoriously bad at this globally, in just sort of the way we carry ourselves, our reputation around the world as tourists, you know, as just treating the rest of the world as a spectacle for our enjoyment. But I also think we kind of do that with history too. Like we tend to, you know, when history becomes a kind of, it's just sort of an intellectual game or a intellectual sort of curiosity, a collection of neat facts about the past.
Something you can be a buff about.
Yeah, something you can be a buff about. I mean, John, this is your bailiwick, so this is what you do for a living, is kind of connect the reality of history to, you know, actual lives, students' lives.
Yeah, I do think on the first trip, so we talked, you know, 2 weeks ago about the influence of Flannery O'Connor on both of our imaginations, and that would have been the 92, 93, I guess, that we were in the class reading her. And so I think we couldn't have articulated it at the time in 97, but I think when we first started out, there was a sense of like, you know, we felt self-conscious as like Southerners, people from the South, like that was an active part of our identity. But a sense of like, there's a South out there that, you know, we belong to, but we don't really know. So we want to get out there and see it. Something in the O'Connor fiction had resonated with us very deeply, even though, again, most of that was alien to our personal experience. But I think that the sense of, a participant and not a tourist has only increased, I guess, as we've hopefully matured a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to need to duck out.
Yeah.
I've enjoyed the conversation again. I believe we're around in 2 weeks again, talking, I think, about Selma, which is a story you don't want to miss.
Yeah, this is.
All 25 minutes of it.
I know that there's been a lot of heavy stuff here this week and last time, and Selma's story is pretty heavy too, but it's also just hilarious, kind of hilarious. There's some really funny moments in a comic sense. So I hope you'll come back for that. And yeah, let's go ahead and say again, we're going without a roadmap here. Let's do this again in 2 weeks, same time, if that's okay with everybody. Will. In the meantime, I will. We'll see if we can't get Facebook working. I do want to throw one thing out. This is pencil this in because we're this pretty firm. But next week at this same time at 12 o'clock, we're going to start doing I'm going to try to start a series of conversations with some of the people around the South who've kind of inspired us and continue to inspire us, and artists that from visual artists to maybe a chef or two, or a writer, musician. That's the goal. Have a conversation, a deeper South conversation with some of those people who've been giving us so much. So one person next week at 12 o'clock, we're going to have a chat. I hope you'll come back for that, with an artist who Matt knows down in New Orleans called Nick Aziz. He's a photographer, curator. He works at the New Orleans Museum of Art. He's a really provocative thinker, and image maker, I guess you could say, a photographer, not just a photographer, works in multiple media. And we've got one image in particular that Nick has done that speaks to this, some of what we've been talking about here today in terms of American history, in terms of this kind of lust for domination, this sort of violence that's part of our DNA. That we're going to talk a little bit about that, and then talk about what Nick has been up to lately, which I think is he's forming his own kind of artistic responses to the Ahmaud Arbery murder. So I hope you'll come back in 1 week, same time. Hopefully not the same technical issues, but I hope some of y'all will come back for that. Of course, I will send out a reminder to everybody. If you're not getting reminders by emails or invites and you would like to, please let me know. Thank you all for being here again. It's so great to see you all and to talk with you. It really is.
Thank you, Pete.
Thank you. I appreciate it. We will see you in a week.
Okay.
Take care.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.